The correct understanding. General Audience number 45 of October 22nd, 1980. For quite a long time, Christ's following statement in the Sermon on the Mount has stood at the center of our Wednesday meetings. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to desire her in a reductive way has already committed adultery with her, toward her, in his heart. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. These words have an essential meaning for the entire theology of the body contained in Christ's teaching. This is why we rightly attribute great importance to their correct understanding and interpretation. Already in our last reflection, we observed that Manichaean teaching, both in its earlier and later expressions, conflicts with these words. In fact, it is not possible to read in the statement from the Sermon on the Mount analyzed here a condemnation or accusation of the body. If anything, one could see in it a condemnation of the human heart. Our reflections up to this point, however, show that even if the words of Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28 contain an accusation, their object is primarily the man of concupiscence. These words do not so much accuse the heart as subject it to a judgment, or better call it to a critical and, in fact, self-critical examination, whether or not it yields to the concupiscence of the flesh. When we penetrate into the deep meaning of the statement in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, we should note, however, that the implicit judgment about desire as an act of concupiscence of the flesh contains in itself not the negation, but rather the affirmation of the body as an element that, together with the spirit, determines man's ontological subjectivity and participates in his dignity as a person. To conclude, the judgment about the concupiscence of the flesh has thus a meaning essentially different from the one that Manichaean ontology is able to presuppose and that necessarily springs from it. The body in its masculinity and femininity has been called from the beginning to become the manifestation of the Spirit. It becomes such a manifestation also through the conjugal union of man and woman when they unite with each other so as to form one flesh. Elsewhere, see Matthew 19, 5 through 6, Christ defends the inviolable rights of this unity, through which the body, in its masculinity and femininity, takes on the value of a sign, in a certain sense, a sacramental sign. And further, when he warns against concupiscence of the flesh, he expresses the same truth about the ontological dimension of the body and confirms its ethical meaning, consistent with his teaching as a whole. This ethical meaning has nothing in common with Manichaean condemnation. Rather, it is deeply penetrated by the mystery of the redemption of the body, about which St. Paul writes in Romans. See Romans chapter 8, verse 23. The redemption of the body does not, at any rate, indicate ontological evil as a constitutive attribute of the human body, but points only to man's sinfulness, by which he lost, among other things, the clear sense of the spousal meaning of the body, in which the interior dominion and freedom of the Spirit expresses itself. As we have already emphasized above, what is at issue here is a partial, potential loss, in which the sense of the spousal meaning of the body is in some way confused with concupiscence and easily lets itself be absorbed by it. The adequate interpretation of Christ's words from Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, as well as the proxies in which the authentic ethos of the Sermon on the Mount is realized step by step, must be absolutely free from Manichaean elements in thought and attitude. A Manichaean attitude would have to lead to the annihilation of the body, if not real, then at least intentional, to a negation of the value of human sex, that is, of the masculinity and femininity of the human person, or at least to their mere toleration within the limits of the need marked off by procreation. By contrast, on the basis of Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount, the Christian ethos is characterized by a transformation of the human person's consciousness and attitudes, both the man's and the woman's, such as to express and realize the value of the body and of sex according to the Creator's original plan, placed as they are at the service of the communion of persons, which is the deepest substratum of human ethics and culture. While for the Manichaean mentality, the body and sexuality constitute, so to speak, an anti-value, for Christianity, on the contrary, they always remain a value not sufficiently appreciated, as I will explain in more detail below. The latter attitude shows what should be the form of the ethos in which the mystery of the redemption of the body takes root, so to speak, in historical soil of man's sinfulness. This is expressed by the theological formula that defines the state of historical man as status naturae lapse simul ac redempte, the state of fallen and at the same time redeemed nature. Anti-value, or value not sufficiently appreciated. One must interpret Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, in the light of this complex truth about man. Even if they contain a certain accusation of the human heart, all the more do they turn to it with an appeal. The accusation of the moral evil that the desire born from carnal intemperate concupiscence contains within itself is at the same time a call to overcome this evil. If victory over evil must consist in detachment from it, hence the severe words in the context of Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, nevertheless, one must only detach oneself from the evil of the act, in the case at hand, the interior act of concupiscence, and one must never transfer the negativity of this act to its object. Such a transfer would signify, perhaps not in a fully conscious way, a certain acceptance of the Manichaean anti-value. It would not constitute a real and deep victory over the evil of the act, which is evil by its moral essence, and thus an evil of a spiritual nature. On the contrary, there would be concealed in it the great danger of justifying the act to the detriment of the object. The essential error of the Manichaean ethos consists precisely in this. It is evident that in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, Christ demands detachment from the evil of concupiscence, or of the look of inordinate desire. But his statement does not allow us to suppose in any way that the object of this desire, namely the woman at whom he looks with lustful desire, is an evil. This clarification seems to be lacking at times in some wisdom texts. We must therefore clarify the difference between accusation and appeal. Given that the accusation directed against the evil of concupiscence is at the same time an appeal to overcome it, it follows that this victory must go hand in hand with an effort to discover the authentic value of the object, in order that the Manichaean anti-value may not take root in man, in his consciousness and will. In fact, it is a fruit of the evil of concupiscence, that is, of the act about which Christ speaks in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, that the object to which this act turns is for the human subject a value not sufficiently appreciated. If in the words analyzed from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, the human heart is accused of concupiscence, or if it is put on guard against that concupiscence, at the same time and by the same words, it is called to discover the full meaning of that which in the act of concupiscence constitutes for it a value not sufficiently appreciated. As we know, Christ said, "Whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Adultery committed in the heart can and should be understood as a devaluation or impoverishment of an authentic value, as an intentional privation of that dignity to which the integral value of her femininity corresponds in the person in question. The words of Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28 contain a call to discover this value and this dignity and to reaffirm them. It seems that only if one understands the words quoted from Matthew in this way does one respect their semantic content. To conclude these brief considerations, it should be emphasized once again that the Manichaean way of understanding and evaluating man's body and sexuality is essentially foreign to the gospel. It does not conform to the exact meaning of the words in the Sermon on the Mount pronounced by Christ. The call to master concupiscence of the flesh springs precisely from an affirmation of the personal dignity of the body and of sex, and only serves such dignity. Anyone who wants to see a Manichaean perspective in these words would be committing an essential error.